Hello and welcome to Trains in Viettic, and yet another video from me. I still exist, therefore another video. So today we're going to talk about gauges and scales in the model railway hobby. You might think scale and gauge are the same thing, but there's a big difference between the two. So what I'll do is I'll start the titles and then we can talk about them. To start off with on this video, I want to thank the Ultra Modern Railway Group for their brilliant guide to this subject. So I'll leave a link to the website at the bottom, so if you want to find out more information, visit them. So many people know that I model in 00 gauge. But what is 00 gauge? And what is gauge? And then you have the question of what is scale. So gauge is quite simply the distance between the rails, and I happen to have a part of track here to show that. This is T gauge, which stands for tiny. This is 009 or HOE or N gauge. All three use the same track. I don't have a piece of 00 track because that's all in a box, but I do have a final piece of track just here. So let me just move a few bits and I'll show you. The nice thing about being a model railwayer is you end up with so many different things. So this is G gauge track, and then when you compare that to T gauge track, you can see the width of the track is the same. The width of a single piece of track is the same as the distance between the two track on T. So as you can see, you can easily fit that in the middle. But I don't have all the different gauges here. The gauges which I am aware of is T, which stands for tiny, or there is another meaning for T. Then we go on to Z. Then we go into me dropping everything on the floor. Then we go on to N gauge track, N gauge. But N gauge, you've got several different standards of N gauge. So you've got European N gauge, English N gauge, American N gauge, and another country's N gauge. So all three use the same width track, but they are all at different scales. Then we go on to 00. Then we go on to O, which is the original Hornby track. But 00 is also HO, which are two different scales. Then you go on to O. Then you go on to G or 1. G is actually narrow gauge, so that makes it a bit more fun because you also have narrow gauge. So G is a narrow gauge standard. So the full gauge would be wider. What do I mean by narrow gauge? That's a very good question, as we're still on the subject of gauges. If you wander down to your railway station and have a look at the track, you'll see that it's a standard gauge apart. I can never remember the gauge. I think it's 6 foot 5 inches, and that's standard gauge. But Brunel, he had a broad gauge track, which was, I can't remember how wide it is. Then you have track which is narrow gauge, so that's a narrower distance between the two rails. So some people represent a standard gauge track, other people represent narrow gauge track. If you go and ride on a small gauge track, that's narrow gauge, and you quite often find it on parks and things. The original narrow gauge was used in mines and pits and things like that, so that stock could be pulled out of the mines. Then the produce in these wagons would be unloaded to the standard gauge tracks. So places whereabouts you can still see original narrow gauge is the Festiniog Railway in Wales. They are one of the largest narrow gauge railways in England. But we have a rather standard-ish narrow gauge use. But if you go to countries like Switzerland, you'll see that they have standard gauge, and then they have two different widths of narrow gauge. So, as I said, standard gauge is not standard throughout. So there's a list of gauges I have told you for standard gauge. So we have gauge 1, which is 1 to 32 scale, which run on a 45mm track. Scale is the percentage of real thing to small thing. I'm 1:1 scale. If I was to create a model of me half my size, that would be 1:2 scale. So each time you make it smaller, it will be 1 to whatever. Then we have UKO gauge, which is 1 to 43 scale, and that run on 32mm track. Then we have O scale, EM scale, P4 scale. They are all a scale. They're all a scale of 1 to 76, but O run on 16.5mm track. EM gauge run on 18mm track, and P4 run on 18.84mm track. So that's the space between the two tracks. But as I said earlier, O gauge doesn't run on the correct scale track. HO scale run on the same width track as O, but that run at a scale of 1 to 87 scale. So you can see you have four gauges quite similar to each other, but they all represent different scales. Then we have our N gauges. These run on 9mm track. So you have UK N gauge, which is 1 to 148 scale. Then for US EU, which is 1 to 160 scale. Both of these run on a 9mm track. Then you have Z gauge, which run on a 6.5mm track and is 1 to 220 scale. So you can see that there's a lot of difference. Our O gauge is a hybrid gauge. We run HO track, but we scale at 1:76 mm. So you will never get a true scale model of a loco in 00 gauge, as we are a compromise. The story behind why it's 00 is because it's a 00 gauge when you have HO, which is half of O. So you can see again those two are a mismatch. I'll quickly grab one of these to demonstrate to you. In this box here I have a lovely Rocco model, which is HOE. So this is 1:87 scale running on N-gauge track. When here we have a 00 model, which is 1:76 scale running on a, I can't remember what I just said, gauge track. So you can see, comparing to those two, you can see that there is a size difference. So let me go back to my notes. I just brought up the subject again of narrow gauge. So I'll go and actually I just need to say one more thing with O gauge. That's again is two different gauges. You got the British O gauge and then the American O gauge. And then 00 track run at a 1 foot to 4 millimeter scale. So for every 1 foot you're representing, that's 4 millimeters is how large that would be. This is quite an interesting side subject of imperial versus metric. Converting an imperial measurement, which is a foot, and converting it to millimeters is something I just find interesting. So let's go on to narrow gauge. Again, referring you back to the website I was on earlier. So this is G gauge. You can run gauge 1 locos on this, but the track would be out of scale. This is 45 millimeter track between top and bottom, and this run at a 1:20.3 scale. So this is quite an interesting scale. Next, I do apologise, but I don't have any of these to show. We have ON30, which is also known as OE O-16.5, and that's 1:43 scales, and that run on a 16.4mm track. You'll recognise that number before because that's actually the same size track as 00 HO. Then the next one I use is 009, which run on a 9mm track, which is N-gauge track. You then have, on the HO scale, the loco I just showed you, which is HOE, and that's a 1:84 scale, and that run on a 9mm track. So you can see that different scales actually change sizes to that. So most of the time these gaugings don't make much of a difference. When I go to my model shop, I can ask, do you deal in G gauge? And they'll know I'm talking about this scale. I can ask, do you have any N gauge? They wouldn't give me this because this is 009. But if I said, do you have any 009? They would give me this. And then a few shops, if you said, do you have any T gauge? They would give you this. So, I hope you have enjoyed this video. It's something different. I'm trying to do some videos exploring more of the theoretical side of the hobby compared to the practical side of the hobby. So thank you everybody for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you all next Saturday at my new upload time of 8 o'clock. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you very much, Richard.